Now that we've finished all of that prep work, we've concepted, sketched, painted, removed the background, prepped those elements, everything has been building up to this moment, which is arranging those elements into a perfect seamless pattern. So let's go ahead and get started. So quick reminder to go ahead and save your progress. So Command S, and now we want to start a new canvas. So Command N on your keyboard will open up a new document, and I want to go over here to where it says inches and change it to pixels and have my pixels be 12,000 by 12,000. Resolution should be 300 ppi and the color mode should be RGB. The rest of your settings should match what I have here. So 12,000 pixels is the equivalent, here I'll show you, if we change it to inches, it's 40. So 12,000 pixels is the same thing as 40 by 40 inches. So what we're making here is the block, which is that one part of the pattern that gets repeated infinitely. So a 40 by 40 inch block is actually pretty massive. So to be totally honest, anything from 5,000 pixels and up is going to work here as a block. I just prefer working in really large files, just in case I need to use that full 40-inch block later. That's why I prefer using larger file types. So again, anything 5,000 pixels and up is going to work here. I just prefer working on ginormous canvases. So choose a pixel size that works best for you, but I'm gonna go ahead and bring mine back to 12,000 by 12,000. And one more thing I want to point out is you want to make sure that artboards is turned off. If you see a check mark here, go ahead and click it once to disable that, because the tool we'll be using later called Pattern Preview doesn't work if artboards is turned on. So make sure that's off. Again, all of these other settings remain the same. I'll go ahead and press Create. So the first thing I'm going to do now that I have this new canvas created is save it. So File, Save As. I'm going to save to my computer, on my desktop, in this folder called Sweet Florals. I'm just going to click down here where it says sweetflorals.psd to auto-populate my file name. And I'm going to add block to the end of this. And right now it's a PSD, which is a Photoshop format. I'm actually going to switch that to a large document format, which will change the extension up here to PSB. So a Photoshop file and a large document format file are essentially the exact same thing. The only difference is that large document format file will allow you to save your file to be over 2 gigabytes. So standard Photoshop files, which again are PSD, they only allow you to go up to 2 gigs or less. But because I'm using such a massive canvas size, and I'm gonna have a lot of layers here when we start getting into color adjustments, my file might very well be over 2 gigabytes. So to go ahead and prepare myself for that now, I wanna go ahead and make sure that that large document format file is selected and double check that my extension up here is PSB. Again, the only difference here is this is going to allow me to save files over 2 gigabytes, which this one might be. All right, so Sweet Florals block.psb is ready to go in my Sweet Florals folder. I'll go ahead and press Save. And again, you want to come up here and look at your tab and make sure that that file name changed. If it still says unnamed, go ahead and close it by hitting that X. Then go back into your folder, find that block file, and double-click it to open in Photoshop, and then take a look over here at your tabs to make sure that the correct file name is there. Sometimes Photoshop can get a little bit buggy with that Save As command, so I always want to double check my tabs and make sure I'm on the right file name. So the golden rule of seamless patterns is whatever gets cropped off on one side of your block must be repeated perfectly on that other side. That way, when this pattern gets repeated and stacked, it will line up absolutely perfectly every time. I used to have to do this manually in Photoshop, but now with this pattern preview tool, it makes it a lot simpler for me to create my patterns because it's going to do that part for me. I'll show you how. So just like before, we have our 2 tabs up here. We have the Sweet Florals tab with all of our elements in it, and then we have the block file over here. So what I want to do is go ahead, select my Sweet Florals tab, break it apart from the others, and then go through, click my very bottom layer, scroll to the top, and select all of my layers by holding Shift and clicking. That went ahead and got all of them. And now I can click my layers and drag them on to this new canvas up here. So they're all getting cropped off the page, but that's okay because you see them over here in your layers panel. So the first thing I want to do is just bring them all to the center of the canvas. So I want my Move tool to be selected, which again is V on your keyboard. And then up here at this top menu, I can click this icon to center everything on a vertical axis, and this icon over here to perfectly center everything. Command T will select everything, and I can just bring it down here to the bottom of my canvas, out of the way, and press Enter to set that transformation. Go ahead and click anywhere on your canvas to deselect all of these layers. So again, with that Move tool selected, which is V, I want to go up here and double check and make sure that Auto Select is turned on. What this means is I can go over here, click, and drag my layer around. If Auto Select isn't on, and I tried to grab one of these layers, it would only move the layer that's selected over here in my layers panel. So if I try to grab this stuff, it's still that one layer that's selected because you can only make selections in your layer panel. I don't want that, so I'm going to go over here, turn on Auto Select, and now I can grab these elements as they come. So remember, whatever gets cropped off on one part of your canvas must be repeated perfectly down here at the bottom. I used to do this manually, and I'm going to show you a quick example of how. You don't have to follow along for this part though. So the way I used to make sure that whatever got cut off duplicated perfectly at the bottom was I'd make sure that that layer was selected, hit Command J on my keyboard to duplicate the layer, Command T to open up Transform, and because I would want this to be perfectly duplicated on the vertical axis, I would go over here to my numbers and hit plus 12,000. Because again, that's how large my square canvas is. And then press Enter twice to set the transformation. So now you see that what's getting cut off at the top is perfectly repeated at the bottom. If I had this bloom getting cut off over here, I would do the same thing. So with that layer selected, I would hit Command J, Command T to open up Transform, and over here on the X-axis, I would hit plus 12,000, Enter twice, and it would be perfectly sliced so that the other part would repeat over here. So again, that's the old way of doing things, but now with Pattern Preview, it makes it a lot simpler and I don't have to do that manually anymore. So I'm going to show you how. First, I'm going to delete those extra pieces since I no longer need them. I'm going to move everything back to where it was so we can start with a clean slate. And I'm going to go up to View, Pattern Preview. You'll see here that Pattern Preview works best with smart objects, which is why we went ahead and made all of those layers smart objects in the previous lesson so that it'll work with this tool. All right, I'll go ahead and press OK. And now if you zoom out, so Command minus minus minus, you'll see that it's already duplicating this pattern. It's making it a seamless pattern for us. It's kind of hard to tell right now because all of our elements are squeezed down here into this bottom corner, but once we start moving them around, you'll see the true magic of this tool. So I'll press V on my keyboard to get back to my Move tool, and now if I click one of these elements and move it, you can see that it moves for the entire pattern. So over here with this blue square, this is our actual canvas. That blue square is actually 40 by 40 inches. And you can see right here when the tip of that flower is getting cut out of that blue square, it's appearing right down here at the bottom. So essentially, this Pattern Preview tool is allowing us to see exactly what this pattern looks like as a repeat in real time. We don't have to do any of the math. We don't have to perfectly slice our elements and repeat them on the other side manually. It's doing it all for us. So I'll hit Command plus plus a few times just to get a little closer in. And the way that I like to build my repeat patterns is by starting with the largest element and then moving down. So largest, second largest, and then I use those detail fillers to fill in the gaps. So I'll show you how I build it. So I have my largest element right here. I'll bring my full facing bloom in next to it. And what I want to do is find areas where it feels like a nice snug fit. So maybe I'll rotate this hero element a little bit. So clicking it to select it, I'll hit Command T on my keyboard to open up Transform. And I might rotate it slightly over like this so it feels a little bit more graceful. Perfect. So again, you can see when I move this element, all of the other replications of this same hero element are also moving, which is pretty cool. I'll write Enter to set the transformation. And again, with my Move tool selected, which is V on my keyboard. And again, look for opportunities to tuck these elements in where they feel nice and natural and smooth. And here's the cool thing. You don't just have to use one hero element. We can duplicate it and use it a few different times in our block. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now before I start moving around all of these medium and detail elements, because again, I'm working from large to small. That'll give me the best opportunity to fit things in a way that feels nice and natural. So with my Move tool selected, which is V, I'll go ahead and click once on our hero element. You can see that that means it gets selected over here in our Layers panel. And then I'll hit Command J to duplicate that layer. So now over here on our Layers panel, you can see there's actually two right here. It's hard to tell on the artboard because the top layer is covering the bottom layer perfectly. But we can use our Move tool, break it apart a little bit, and find another place on the canvas for it. So one thing with seamless patterns is you don't necessarily want to see where that block starts and stops. The whole idea is the entire pattern should just feel like a very fluid image. So to do that, I don't want my elements to look too repetitive. So one trick I have is using the Transform tool. I'm going to flip it. So with my second hero element over here, it's already selected. I'll hit Command T on my keyboard and then Control click it and choose Flip Horizontal. Perfect. With the Transform tool still selected, I'm going to go over here until I see that double-headed curved arrow, and I'm just going to reposition this slightly. And maybe this is down here at the bottom of the elements. Press Enter. And again, we're going to get to all of those guys in a little bit. Don't stress that they're there. And let's go ahead and duplicate this hero element as well. So I'll click it once to make sure it's selected over here in the Layers panel. Then I'll hit Command J to duplicate that layer. Command T to open up Transform. And again, I'll Control click and flip it horizontally. And maybe I'll put this one up here. And again, with the Transform selected, I'm going to resize it a little bit to have it fit really nicely in this area. And then I'll press Enter. Cool, now it's time to start moving on to the medium elements. So right now we have our other hero kind of blocking the way. So what I'm going to do is click that hero once to select it in the Layers panel, and then move it down to the bottom of the Layers panel. You can do that manually by clicking and dragging your layer all the way down, or you can do what I do, which is the key command, which is Shift Command left bracket. And that moves it all the way to the bottom of the Layers panel, so that now all of these medium and detail elements are above it, so they're easy to click and move around. So at this point, I'm going to use those tools that I just explained and arrange this block so that it feels nice and snug. So V to get my Move tool, and I'm just going to be looking for opportunities to fit these elements in a way that feels really natural. It can help to start with one corner of the canvas and slowly make your way to the other quadrants. One thing I want to try out is having these elements overlap each other. After all, the original was painted in watercolor, so having different sections overlap could look really nice. So if I zoom in over here, which again is Z and then pulling in, if I have these two leaves overlapping, one is very clearly on top of the other, and it doesn't feel very natural like watercolor. So what I'm going to do is apply a blending mode to all of the layers. So I'll scroll up to the top of my layers panel, select that topmost layer, scroll all the way to the bottom, press and hold Shift on my keyboard, and select our final layer so that all of our layers are selected. And then I'm going to come up here to where it says Normal and change the blending mode to Multiply. Cool. Go ahead and click anywhere on your canvas to deselect your layers. And now when you move layers on top of each other like this, you'll see how those two colors blend together in a really beautiful way. And because this is how watercolors work, they're a transparent medium, using a blending mode like Multiply can help it feel a lot more natural. All right, Command 0 to fit to screen. And since I applied that Multiply blending mode to all of the layers, you're gonna see that with everything. So any parts we overlap, you'll see that transparency blend mode come through, which is pretty cool. All right, I'm going to continue arranging my elements on the board. Command minus to see my board in its entirety again, and I'm just going to finish that selection. So one thing I'm going to do is duplicate this hero element one more time. So again, clicking on that layer to select it, I'll hit Command J, Command T to open up transform, and I'm actually going to shrink this one down by clicking one corner and dragging it down a bit. And now I just have to find a spot for it. This is why it's really helpful to work from large to small, otherwise you kind of run out of spots for your elements. All right, that area is looking pretty good. I'll press Enter to set the transformation and start rearranging. So remember, click to select a layer, Command J to duplicate it, Command T to open up transform, and you can wiggle it around and find a nice spot for it. If one area is looking a little bit too homogeneous in one color, I'm going to bring in another color just to separate it out a little bit. Because remember, I want this pattern to feel nice and even when it gets repeated. I'll grab my other leaf, so V to get my move tool, click and select, Command J to duplicate that layer, Command T to open up transform, and now I'm going to find some spots for it. You can do a nice overlap here as well. I've got these dots over here. I might start putting them in areas that are a little bit more refined. And don't forget, you have your signature over here as well. So I'm gonna wait until my block is completely arranged before I deal with that. So at this point, I'm looking for gaps in my pattern that should be filled. So you can zoom out at any time and see how this seamless is coming together and get a nice overall glimpse to make sure it feels really nice and fluid and even. But right now, I'm seeing these gaps right here, which is right here in my block. So I want to go ahead and fill that in. Command plus 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 plus. I'll go ahead and fill it in with this bloom down here. So I'll select it, hit Command J to copy it, Command T to open up transform, and I want to find a nice snug place for it. And now if I zoom back out again, you can see that gap has been filled and it looks a lot nicer. So at this point, I'm just going to go through, start duplicating my dots and really filling in these extra gaps so that it feels very full. Command 0 to fit to screen, and let's start fine tuning. What I want to do here is put the warm colored dots in areas that have cool colors next to it, and put these cool dots in areas where there's a lot of warm tones. This will help break up the pattern a little bit and feel a lot more even toned. One thing I want to note here is these blue dots being perfectly horizontal from each other is going to be a little bit distracting in the pattern to have such a strong line. So instead, I might bring this dot down here a little bit to break up that monotony. And you'll notice that I'm rotating these dots when I put them in place, and that just helps them feel a little bit more varied, especially with this dot where it has this strong contrast between the indigo and the turquoise. Just rotating it into different angles helps it feel a little bit more varied in that overall pattern. And as we get to tighter areas, you might want to decrease the size of some of those filler elements. And I think it's time for another eyeball test. So I'm going to zoom out, Command minus, 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 and see how this pattern is looking. Honestly, I think that's looking pretty awesome. It feels very even toned. There's no obvious gaps or clusters of one color that aren't evenly broken up with another color. So even in these areas where there's a lot of pink happening, I have some of these turquoise and indigo leaves that help break it up a little bit. If you keep zooming out, so Command minus, 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 you'll see how tight that pattern actually gets, which is a little bit crazy. So Command 0 to snap back into my canvas and fit to screen. So the very last thing I want to do is find a nice spot to tuck in my signature. So I'll click my signature. It's kind of hard to grab actually, so I'll press Z and pull in, V to get to my move tool, and now I'll click it. Perfect. Command 0 to fit back to screen, and Command T to open up transform. So the key to adding your signature to your pattern block is to find a way where you can tuck your signature in where it's not too obvious or distracting, but it flows very nicely with the illustration. If your signature were giant and huge and that block gets repeated every 10, 20, 30 inches, it might look a little bit distracting. So within this block, I want to find a place for this signature where I can just tuck it in and it doesn't stand out too much. And I think the spot for it is actually going to be right here on this dark leaf. So again, I'll rotate it around, shrink it down a little bit to fit, and press Enter to set that transformation. So if you're looking at that and you think I'm crazy because I just hid my signature, hear me out. With that signature layer selected, I'm going to go up here to my blending mode and change it to screen. Now it becomes a lot more evident. I'll zoom in even tighter, so Z and pull in. The only thing I don't like is that it has this halo effect. And this is actually a really quick fix. I'm just going to invert that signature. So Command I on my keyboard, or by going up here to Image, Adjustments, Invert. It's a little bit too faint right now, so I want to bring up that whiteness. So I'll hit Command L on my keyboard to open up my levels and grab this far right toggle and bring it inwards so that my signature is bright white. I'll press OK, Command 0 to fit to screen, and I'll zoom out a few times and see how this looks. I think I'm going to shrink it and make it just a tiny bit smaller because even this is a little bit too intense for me. Again, I want my signature on that block to really reinforce my branding, but I don't want it to be that obvious where it's going to be an eyesore. So Z, and I'll pull in. Again, that signature layer is selected, so I'll hit Command T. Go ahead and press OK, that doesn't bother me. And I'm going to shrink it down, just make it a little bit smaller in that leaf. Press OK. And now back to full screen, Command 0, And let's see how that looks. Perfect. So the signature is definitely there, but it's not too in your face. And that is exactly the way I want it. So quick note here on having your signature within your block. That means that every time your block is repeated, that signature will be repeated as well. So I know some artists who never include their signature for patterns that are intended, especially for fabrics or wallpaper, because they don't want to be too obtrusive by having that signature repeat every, again, 5 inches, 10 inches, 15, whatever your parameters are. And I definitely understand where those artists are coming from. It's really just a personal preference. So for me, having my signature on all of my products, when it makes sense, is really, really important. I absolutely want to reinforce that brand recognition. So if somebody orders an art print of mine, or a coffee mug, or a pillow, somewhere on that product, very, very small, hopefully, my signature is there so that they can always see the original artist behind the design. And again, this is a personal preference for me and the way that I prioritize my brand recognition. Not all artists care that much about having their signature on everything, but I definitely do. If you're having a hard time finding a place to tuck your signature in within that pattern block, don't stress. You can still have your signature included in the next file that we'll be creating today, which is going to be the full-on pattern file. But before we get there, don't forget to go ahead and save, Command S. Always maximize compatibility, don't show again. And check up here to make sure that that is the correct file name that's saving, Sweet Florals Block. And I want to show you guys real quick, if we go up here to View and turn off Pattern Preview, you can see that we're losing some of the elements that got cut off the edge up here. They're not automatically repeating down here. And that's because that repeat is only happening within Pattern Preview. So I'll go back to View, Pattern Preview. I don't need to see that again. And now you'll see that it went ahead and filled in the rest of that block. Where the elements get cut off on one side, they get repeated on the other. So if your elements ever just completely disappear and you're wondering what happened, you want to go ahead and make sure that View, Pattern Preview is enabled. All right, now I'm going to show you how you can save this pattern and fill it in entirely on a separate canvas.